Okay, let's start by setting up a few options in the document that we are going to be using all throughout this project. I want to remind you that the project we are going to be making is a mockup, a fake screenshot for demonstration purposes. This means that some of the assets that you're going to see in this project may need to be adjusted to the needs of the game engine. For example, in this mockup, we are going to treat the background as if it were an illustration, only worrying about what's on the screen. But if you were creating the background asset for an actual game, you may need to extend the background's different shapes so you can parallax the different layers when the character moves. I can't possibly know how you plan to build your game or the tools that you're going to use. This project will teach you everything you need to draw the art for your game. It's just that the details of adapting it to your game tools, it's up to you. With that out of the way, there are a couple of options we need to set up so we can work comfortably. Remember that we are gonna be working with tiles here, so the very first step should be enabling and configuring the grid, so we can build the tile set we talked so much in the previous lesson. Inkscape brings a fully featured and very versatile grid system that's very easy to use. These options are in the Document Properties dialog. So go to File, Document Properties. The grid options are in the Grid tab. To be able to use a grid, you'll have to create it first. First select the type of grid from the drop-down, rectangular or axonometric. The rectangular grid option will create a normal rectangular grid. This is the one we need. The other one, the axonometric grid, will create a grid with inclined angles. This is mostly used to create isometric art. We are not going to be using this type of grid, so you can safely ignore it. A curious thing about this way of handling grids is that you can create more than one grid in the document. Every time you click on the new button, you'll create a new grid. This is completely unnecessary, because you'll rarely need more than one single grid to draw whatever you want. To remove a grid, just click on the button that says Remove. Now for the actual grid options. These options are pretty self-explanatory. They will disable or hide the grid. The next option is very important. Here you select the unit with which you will change the values in these options. If you are following along and want to have the exact same numbers than I do, make sure you set this dropdown to px, pixels. I'm gonna be using a few specific values for line and sizes, and I'm gonna be using the grid to calculate those sizes. I already have all the numbers that work out for me, so if you're following along, make sure to copy all these values. The origin options just slides the grid in the horizontal or vertical axis. Completely useless to use, so you can just ignore these two options. Spacing will make the grid bigger or smaller. Like I said already, I have the size that will work better for us, and that will neatly divide the area of work into nice workable squares. Set the X and Y spacing value to 30. You should see that the grid got a bit bigger. To help you handle yourself better, Inkscape has the two options to add a different colored grid line every certain quantity of other grid lines. For our purposes, I strongly recommend you to set it to 2. So there are 2 squares inside of a stronger colored square. Believe me, this will help you get a bit less confused when moving objects around the grid. The minor and major grid color lines will change the colors and alpha of the minor and major grid lines. This option you can leave it like this, but it can be helpful to change the opacity of the major grid lines so they are a bit more visible than the minor ones. Just click on the color label and move the alpha slider so it's a bit more clearer. Here it will be very easy to change color if you want. Just make sure you don't pick a really strong color that distracts you while working. So try to keep the alpha on the lower side. And that's all you need to know about creating grids for our project. They will really help you design and work with the different tiles we'll be making. But now it's time to learn how to actually use them for drawing. First, of course, you need to enable the snapping functionality in the snapping options bar. Like I said in the Inkscape mini course, when you enable snapping, there should be a few options enabled by default. I recommend you to not touch anything here if you don't know what each of these buttons do. However, if you want to be able to snap to grids, you should enable this little button. By toggling this button on and off, you'll enable and disable the snapping to the grids. This is really useful, because you won't always want to draw to the grid. Sometimes you want to draw other things to the side. So at the moment of working, you're gonna need to constantly come to this button to switch on and off the grid snapping. Great, let's try it. Pick the pen tool and create nodes anywhere in the canvas. You should see that the nodes snap to the grid. Now if you move this shape with the object tool, you should see that the shape also snaps to the grid. A very important detail is that when you move an object with the object tool, the node closest to the mouse will be the one snapping to the grid. This is a common functionality of all snapping in Inkscape. So for example, if I drag this polygon from closer to the top, you'll see the little label that indicates to you that the top node is the one snapping to the grid. But if I drag the shape from the bottom right, you'll see that the bottom right node will be the one that's snapping. And the same happens if I drag from close to the bottom left. This functionality will be important later on when we work on tiles, so keep it in mind. One last thing before the end of this lesson. We want to make a mock-up of a platformer game for mobile phones. So in order to better pre-visualize the area of illustration, I want to draw a rectangle with the dimensions of the screen. I know multiple phones have different dimensions, but we are learning the basics here and we care more about clarity than staying true to the dimensions of a phone. So we are gonna be using a standard monitor dimensions for this game, 1280 by 720, which is also the resolution of the videos in this course. So grab the rectangle tool and drag a normal rectangle of any size. Now with the rectangle tool and the rectangle selected, go to the tool controls bar and make sure this drop down is set to px, pixels. Now we can input the size we want in pixels. In the double view input, set it to 1280 and in the H input, set it to 720. Also make sure Rx and Ry are set to 0. These values control the roundness of the corners and we don't want any roundness. If they have a value, you can click on this button to set it to 0. Remember, this is gonna be the guide that will show the display area, so it shouldn't have any fill whatsoever, only a single black stroke. And now you should see that the grid dimensions that we set up a moment ago fit nicely as far as size with the illustration area. Each measured square is gonna be a single tile. If you were working with different screen proportions or different tile sizes, you may want to experiment a bit with the actual size of the grid in the Document Properties dialog, so that one major square equals one tile in your game. Now it's time to start drawing the assets. And I want to start by creating an asset that uses the grid we created in the last lesson, while at the same time demonstrates in a simplified way pretty much every single function that we are going to be using all throughout the rest of the course. We are going to start by creating our version of the classic question block that appears in most Mario games and its clones. Now, a question block may not seem like an extremely complex asset to make, but I guarantee that we are going to be using 95% of the tools and techniques that you're going to be using to create the other more complex assets. So I think it's a good place to start. One last thing before we start with this lesson. If you watch the Inkscape mini course, in the tips lesson I strongly recommended you to start using shortcuts. There I say that you should have nice comfortable shortcuts for the 4 most used tools in the toolbox: the object, node, pen, and dropper tool. Well, I want to double down on what I said, because from now on, all throughout this course, I'll be using shortcuts to speed up the whole process. I'll remind you that you can change the shortcuts by going to Edit, Preferences, Interface, Keyboard Shortcuts, and the tools are in the Context submenu. I still recommend you to set them to the keys A, S, D, and F, or something similar so they are close to the other default shortcuts. I also have other shortcuts for other operations, but those are not nearly as important. You can go making other shortcuts as you need when you have more experience with the program. Great, let's begin. Grab the rectangle tool, and with the option Snap into Grid enabled, draw a rectangle that fits a single major square. You should see the little blue X as you snap while drawing. First of all, we don't want a stroke in this object yet. You'll see why in a minute, so disable it. Now, in most Mario games and clones, question blocks tend to be of a light yellowish orange, so give it that color. You can copy my colors if you want. As always, I'm using the HSL mode, so you'll have to copy each number for each slider. One last thing, we are gonna be copying the style of the more modern cell phone platformer games, so with the rectangle modifier, round off a bit the edges. You may want to disable snapping, so it won't mess you up as you make small adjustments from now on. Okay, so now we're gonna add a very simple light and shadow to make the asset look a bit nicer and more detailed. Nothing too complex, just a simple hard highlight on top and a hard shadow below. Trust me, a simple highlight and shadow will go a long way to make your art nicer. To create these two shapes, we are gonna be using the intersection method, which you should be familiar with if you watched the techniques lesson. So if you have problems getting something that I'm doing, be sure to rewatch those lessons again. So grab the pen tool and draw the highlight shape on the top part. Notice that I'm following the roundness of the top. It's not just a straight line. Another thing, the highlight is a bit asymmetrical and tilted to one side. This will not only imply that the light source is slightly tilted to the left, but also make the whole object a bit more interesting. I always avoid creating straight lines when I can, and the highlight and shadows is a good place to do this. Of course, don't overdo it. Just a slight tilt is enough to give a more dynamic feel to the whole object. Since the highlight implies that the light source is coming from the top left, the shadow is gonna be slightly tilted to the right. And I'm using the intersection technique to trim the excess off. A very important tip is that you want to constantly zoom to the distance from where it's gonna be viewed. Remember that this mockup represents something that will be displayed in a mobile phone, and that this block is gonna be the size of a single tile. It's a very common beginner mistake to zoom in and draw the sizes of objects completely ignoring the distance from where it's gonna be seen. So always zoom out and make sure that everything has the right proportions and that it's visible. Okay, now to give it some color. Let's just use the direct color technique. By now you should know the steps. Select the highlight and remove the stroke. Sample the local color, go to the L slider and move it a bit up. Repeat the same steps with the shadow, but now move the L slider a bit down. And we are almost done. But there is one important thing that needs to be done, and that is the question mark. And for that we are gonna do something neat. We're gonna make a card symbol. Okay, the first step is making the silhouette of the symbol. And for that, we are not gonna complicate ourselves drawing it. It's just a question mark, so let's use the text tool. So pick the text tool and type a question mark. With the object tool, move the symbol to the center of the block, and holding Ctrl to keep the proportions, scale it so it has the correct size. Make sure it's nice and centered. If you want precision, you could use the Align and Distribute dialog. To open it, go to Object, Align and Distribute. Now select the question mark and then select the block. The order of selection matters here. Make sure the drop-down says Last Selected. And click on these two buttons to center the symbol horizontally and then vertically. Now the symbol is in the exact center. Okay, I'm not convinced with the symbol. I feel that it needs to be a bit thicker. The problem is the font. By default, Inkscape always set the font as Arial. And you can try other fonts and see what funny symbols you can find. But the fastest solution is to change the weight. So with the symbol selected, select the text tool and go to the drop-down right next to the font drop-down and set the weight to the last value, heavy. And that's it, a nice thick question mark. You can try adjusting it a bit more, moving it around or scaling it while holding Shift to make it thicker. It's up to you. Now it's time to make the actual carved symbol. First of all, since we want to give the impression of a carved area, you should make the color of the symbol a bit darker, maybe slightly darker than the shadow color. This will imply that the surface is a bit receding down. Okay, the key to make an area give the impression of being carved in is to use a shadow dropping on itself and a thin rim highlight to accentuate the fact that there is a corner there. Let's start with the shadow. For this we are gonna use the difference technique that I showed you in the technique lesson 1. Rewatch that lesson if you are feeling a bit lost. So duplicate the symbol twice and make the top symbol of a clearly visible random color. Move the top symbol a bit down. Remember that the area that's showing through is gonna be the shadow. When you're happy, select the top symbol and the symbol right below and perform a difference. Now it's just a matter of giving the shadow a shadow color. Now let's repeat the same steps for the rim highlight. But here is a warning. Rim highlights are highlights that are captured by an edge, so they tend to be really small and more intense than normal highlights. Because this highlight is so small, it needs to be fairly intense to be noticeable. Also keep in mind what I told you a while ago about keeping an eye in the size and visibility of the shapes. You don't want to make the shadow or highlight too thin so that it won't be noticeable in the actual game. And that's it. I love creating carved out surfaces, because it really feels like you can go in and touch it. The illusion is really convincing if the colors are right. Of course, this technique I just showed you can be used with pretty much any carved surface you may want to do. Okay, we are done with the main object, but there is one last thing I want to do. In most Mario clones, especially for mobile phones, the assets often get a thick outline so they stand out from the background. So let's do that now. But before starting, there's a couple of things you should know. First, we want a consistent line weight across all assets. I made some tests and I got to the conclusion that at the size I'm working on, the best looking outline is gonna be 3 pixels wide. Of course, if you're not working at the same size that I am, then you should eyeball it and see what works best for you. The important thing is that it's consistent across all assets. Second, I strongly recommend you to separate this outline from the other shapes that makes up the block. You'll see why in a minute. So duplicate the main block shape and remove the fill and give it a stroke. This is gonna be our outline shape. First, the color. This type of games often use an outline with the same color than the main shape, but darker. There is one last detail regarding creating outlines. In Inkscape, all strokes are calculated from the center, in such a way that if you set a stroke of 10 pixels wide, the stroke will grow 5 pixels outside of the shape and 5 pixels inside of the shape. So if we set our outline to 3 pixels wide, 1.5 pixels will go inside and cover some details in the borders. Later on, if we want to create a bigger sized outline, it will eat away even more details from the corners. Luckily, the solution is really simple. Send the stroke object to the bottom of the stack order, so it's below everything. That's one of the reasons why it's a good idea to separate the outline from the rest of the drawing. So now that's below, we need to set it to twice the pixel width, so it shows the pixel width that we want. So go to the stroke style, make sure the drop down next to the width input says px, and then set it to 6 pixels. And now we have an outline of 3 pixels wide that won't get in the way of our drawing. And we are done illustrating the question block. Now it will be a good idea to select everything and hit Ctrl G to group it, to make it easier to manipulate. One final small step. Because we made the block without having in consideration the stroke, now the entire object is 3 pixels bigger than the tile size. Well, this has a couple of solutions. You could just eyeball and try to make the whole shape the size of the tile, but this will bring you problems down the road when you want to export it to the actual game engine. The most accurate but slightly more complex solution is to use the snapping bar to make sure the block has the exact size of the tile. But the problem is that we need to enable and disable a couple of options. Don't worry, it's not that complex. Enable snapping again. What we want is to snap the block group to a grid rectangle. But the problem is that the options by default will make it snap to a corner node. But since the block is rounded, we want to snap it to the corner of the group instead. First, enable these two options. This will enable snapping to bounding boxes and snapping to corners in bounding boxes. A group is basically a bounding box, so this option has to be enabled. And one last step, disable this option. This will force snapping to nodes instead of bounding boxes, and it takes precedence over any other option, so you have to disable it temporarily. Now you should be able to make it snap to a corner, and using the opposite arrow, you can scale it in. As soon as you scale, it's gonna snap and fit perfectly inside the grid rectangle. Now don't forget to turn snapping to nodes back on, cause it's really important for other types of snapping. Well, finally we are done with the block. What you saw here isn't terribly complex, but I can assure you that most of the other assets will be easier to make. Like I said in the intro of this lesson, I wanted to show you an example that demonstrates pretty much all features that we're going to be using in the rest of the course. There is another similar asset, and that is the activated question block. It's the block when has been hit, with no question mark and a darker color. I want you to make this block as an exercise assignment. And if you want extra points, start from zero. Don't use the finalized question block to recolor it and save you some work. I won't be showing you how to do it. First, I want to save some time, and second, it's just the same as this block, only easier. So I strongly recommend you to do it as an exercise. There are a lot of different types of blocks in these types of platformers. It will be a waste of time to show you how to make all possible types of blocks, considering they will use the same techniques you've seen before. However, I do want to make a slightly more complex type of block that will show you how to apply these techniques to more complex assets. In this lesson, we're going to be making this fairly complex brick block. Let's begin with the outline of the block. We want the exact same block roundness than the rest of the block in the game. It will look really weird if you see different types of blocks with different amounts of corner smoothness. So for this we can do a couple of things, but the easiest is to enter the question block group, remember with double click, and when you are inside select only the rectangle and hit Ctrl C to copy. Now very important, you are still inside of the group, so double click in any part of the canvas to leave the group. Make sure that this drop down here says that you are in a layer, otherwise you didn't actually left the group. Now hit Ctrl B to paste the rounded rectangle shape. If you want, you can place it in a grid, though we don't need it on a grid square at all for now. You can just disable the snapping and work to the side if you want. And now for the last step, give it a color. In this case, I'm gonna be using a brick dark orange. You can copy my colors if you want. The next few steps may seem a bit complex, but if you watch and study the previous lesson, you should be able to follow me without any problem. We want to imply that this block is made of a few smaller bricks. For that, we're gonna follow a set of steps. First, with the pen tool, draw a few lines to delineate bricks. A couple of tips here. Don't worry about leaving the silhouette of the block. We're gonna fix that later. Also, I like to make the bricks uneven and skewed. Like I said before, uneven areas are way more interesting than evenly divided areas with straight lines. So this way the whole block looks more appealing and cartoony. Of course, these divisions are meant to be the mortar joints. In masonry, that's the name for the space between the bricks that has mortar. So select all joints and make them bigger with the width drop down. A 3 pixel width worked for me. Finally, give it a darker shade of the local color. By now I think I don't need to remind you the steps. To make it feel more cartoony and less artificial, let's make the joints a bit uneven. And for this we're gonna need to edit the stroke as if it were a path. So we are gonna need to transform all these strokes to path. Luckily that's something super easy to do. Select them all and go to path, stroke to path. Now all the strokes are path. If you want to simplify your work, you can join all these paths into a single shape so they are easier to manipulate. In this case, I just use the shortcut Ctrl+ to make a union. Now double click to add nodes and then move the nodes a bit up and down to make the whole joints more uneven. Be subtle, this is gonna be more noticeable once we add the shadows and highlights. A nice detail you can do is to widen the places where two joints connect. Now there is the problem with the joint shapes. In some parts they leave the silhouette of the block. I believe that you can see how to solve this. That's right, just use an intersection. Great, we are done with the separation between bricks. But now I want to give it an extra something. I want to cut out a bit the silhouette in the area where the joints intersect with the border. And this will help further give the impression that this is a block made by bricks separated by mortar. Not to mention that will result in a more interesting silhouette. The easiest way to do this is to use a difference to cut out those parts. So grab the pen tool and draw this trapezius-like shape. Now, so you don't have to go one by one making 6 different operations, there is a nice little trick you can do. You can select all these shapes and join them into a single shape by using a union. And yes, unions work with shapes that are not intersecting. Now you have a single shape and you only have to do a single difference operation. And now the mortar joints need to be adjusted to this new block silhouette, so I'm sure you know what to do. perform an intersection with their block. Okay, now for the highlight and shadows, we're gonna follow the exact same steps we did before with the question block, with the only difference that we're giving each individual brick a highlight and shadow. So think of each brick as its own separate mini block. Grab the pen tool and draw the highlights. Remember everything that I showed you before. Keep in mind the roundness, make the highlight shape thick enough so it's visible from far away, and try to give it a subtle tilt so it looks a bit more interesting. When the highlight or shadow is close to an edge, you know what to do. You have to perform an intersection to remove the excess. But when it's here on the middle of the block, you have to hide one of the edges below the joint shape. There is no other way around. And for the color of the highlights and shadows, I think that you can do that on your own by now. One last important thing, the shape of the shadow or highlight will imply the form of the brick. So making these shapes that kinda wraps around each brick, it's a nice way to make the bricks more interesting. These choppy lines of the highlights and shadows imply that the particular brick is damaged or chipped away, which is always a nice way to add detail to anything architectural. And we can leave it like this and the job will be done. But I want to add some small extra details to make it look slightly more finished. First, we're gonna add some damage to the bricks. Grab the ellipse tool and draw a few ellipses of small irregular shapes here and there. Make sure to variate the size quite a lot. Add just a few to occupy large spaces with nothing on it. Also make sure the ellipses have the same color as the shadow. This is supposed to be a curved surface. Also, you don't have to use ellipses, but elliptical damage tend to look better than other shape damage. A nice trick is that you can draw more than one ellipse on top of each other to make the shape more irregular quickly without the need to go in there and modify the shape of the ellipse. Now you can add a nice bit of detail with these ellipses and then use the difference technique to create a thin but intense highlight shape. It's important to not overdo with these types of detail. Add these carved areas only to fill the empty areas. Otherwise it will look too filled and distracting. And now it looks a lot better with all that detail. But one last thing I want to do, grab the pen tool and create these polygonal bumps on the joint shapes. What you want to do is to imply that there is damage in the bricks. When you are done drawing them, join them to the joints with a union. Again, you should keep in mind the quantity of detail, and only add a few where it feels too empty. Here's another nice thing I like to do. I like to draw these cracks on the borders. But there is a really nice looking detail you can add specifically to the horizontal cracks, since they have a border that's opposite to a light source, and that is to give it a really thin highlight. This will make the crack pop up more. And now for the final step, the 3-pixel outline. Here you can simply pick the block shape, duplicate it, give it a 6-pixel stroke we talked about in the last lesson, and move it to the background. As far as the color, make it slightly darker than the darkest shape, and it's done. Don't forget to group everything and make it fit a grid unit like we did in the last lesson. This block is actually the single most complex shape you'll be doing in this course, so congratulations on finishing it. I want to remind you that if you want to use this block as a floor or walkable tile, it's gonna be problematic because of the roundness of the borders. A nice exercise will be to make one of these blocks to function as a floor, like the bricks in the level 1-2 in the original Mario, so you're gonna have to redraw one of these without the rounded edges, and maybe with a bit less detail so it won't call attention to itself since it's a floor tile.